The disclosure about the properties that a company has elicited by Item 102 of Regulation SK for your 10K probably isn't all that exciting. It's one of the more mundane sections of any of your SEC filings, a short section. But don't let that lull you into sleep and not do this section justice. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek and I'm a big fan of yous. So it's silly that I'm making this video, right? But dude, it's even more silly that you're watching it. So the disclosure is going to depend on your company's circumstances as to whether your property section in the Form 10K has any real meaning. For many companies, the value of the land that a company owns is a real drop in the bucket compared to their total assets. But there are those companies, particularly ones that have fallen on hard times, where the land that it owns is one of its key assets. Here are 5 things about the property section you should know. One, is this disclosure even necessary? 2, the challenging materiality determination. 3, look at what your peers disclose. 4, consider disclosing future plans. 5, tie to your financials. 1, is this disclosure even necessary? So for many companies, it probably would not be, but for the fact that Item 102 still requires some disclosure about it. It's a regulatory remnant from a golden age when land was king. The SEC recently has come out and said as much. When the SEC's 2019 FAST Act amendments simplified many of the SK disclosure requirements, the agency did tweak this item, and in so doing, the SEC essentially acknowledged that for many companies, there are no physical properties that are important to an investor's evaluation about whether they should buy your stock. Yet, Item 102 still remains, so even though what the properties disclosure in your 10K might look like now after these 2019 amendments, you do have some disclosure about it. 2, the challenging materiality determination. So disclosures are only required if the properties are material based on quantitative and qualitative factors. Materiality judgments often can be challenging, at least the close calls are, but it's probably not as challenging in this area as it is in others. The key to deciding what properties to disclose, if any, is ascertaining which ones are materially important physical properties. That's in the regulation. The SEC doesn't define what that is. That's where you have to make a judgment call based on judicial determinations of what materiality is. Instruction 1 to Item 102 says that if appropriate, property descriptions can be provided on a collective basis. Many companies take advantage of this. So here's an example of that from Microsoft's 10K. Of course, many companies don't have that much of a challenge. Their headquarters is their only physical property. That's some short and sweet disclosure. 3, look at what your peers disclose. So this is one of those disclosure areas where looking at what your peers, your closest competitors, are disclosing is important. You don't want your disclosure to stick out like a sore thumb. So over the years, certain informal disclosure standards have emerged industry by industry. And then you should be aware that some industries are heavily dependent on the properties they own, and they have extra disclosure obligations mandated by guides that apply to those specific industries. So the SEC has these guides. So there's a guide for the oil and gas industry, there's a guide for the real estate industry, and there's another guide for mining industry. So these guides, other additional disclosure requirements about the properties that the companies in these industries own. Look at, and if you're in those industries, you should be well aware of that. 4, consider disclosing future plans. So even though we're not required by the SEC's rules, some companies disclose the future plans for their properties. After all, investors want to see a company growing, expanding into new locations if you're in that kind of an industry. Or perhaps you're disposing of excess property space, something that will undoubtedly be a trend in a socially distant world. Right? Investors will probably react positively if we're able to cut your overhead because employees are working from home more often. Note that if your company disposes of a significant amount of assets, and the trigger is equity and the net book value of such assets or the amount paid or received that exceeded 10% of total assets during the last fiscal year, during the last fiscal year, other than in the ordinary course of business, that's a trigger for having to file a Item 2.01 Form 8K, and I have a separate Vid-Guide about how to make those filings on an Item 2.01 Form 8K. 5, tie to your financials. So the auditors have their own standards to consider when it comes to the properties disclosure, what they disclose in the financials, and that might influence the disclosure that you have in the property section of the 10K. So ensure you're taking a gander at what the auditors say about properties in the financials so that the disclosure is consistent between the financials and the body of the 10K.